Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you're asked to create some training, maybe an online course, right?
Hmm.
And you're handed this stack of slides. You know the drill loads of information, maybe bullet points, definitely a quiz at the
Oh,
end.
yeah. The standard package.
It feels incredibly familiar, doesn't it? Almost automatic, like what? Like school.
It really does. It's so deeply embedded, isn't it? It feels like the default setting for training,
Mm-hmm.
both for the people designing it and, frankly, for the clients asking for it.
Exactly. It's kind of the path of least resistance sometimes, but what if that familiar, comfortable, almost automatic approach isn't actually solving the real problem?
Right.
What if, despite all the effort, it's just creating training that nobody really needs? Or, training that nobody really wants
Yeah.
because it's just not hitting the mark.
That's the fundamental challenge, yeah.
Yeah.
We get so caught up in the mechanics, how to present the information, how to build the course, what tools to use, that we often forget to ask the most important questions first. Like, why are we even doing this? What specific problem are we trying to solve here?
And crucially, what should people actually do differently when it's all over?
Precisely. What's the outcome we're aiming for in the real world?
Absolutely. And that shift in perspective is exactly what we're diving into today. Welcome to a deep dive into a fundamentally different way of thinking about designing, learning, and training.
Hmm.
We're pulling our insights today from a source that really makes you rethink things. Kathy Moore's insightful book, Map It, The Hands-On Guide to Strategic Training Design.
It's such a great resource. It really serves as a powerful antidote to that default school model thinking we were just talking about. Gives you a practical methodology to move way beyond just, delivering content.
And that's perfect for you, our listener. You're someone who loves gaining knowledge quickly but thoroughly, always looking for those aha moments without getting lost in just endless information.
Right, cutting through the noise.
Our mission in this deep dive is exactly that. Cut through those common assumptions around traditional training and explore a powerful, more strategic approach. One that doesn't start with the content, the slides.
No.
It starts relentlessly with solving real, measurable business problems.
It's about moving from being someone who just fulfills orders for training like, here are the slides, make a course, to becoming more of a performance consultant, someone who helps identify and solve the right problem,
Mm-hmm.
even if the solution turns out not to be training at all.
Precisely. It's a complete mindset shift, really. So get ready to challenge some really common ideas you might bump into every day and discover how training, or maybe more accurately, a solution that might include training,
Yeah.
can be something truly different, demonstrably effective, and yeah, maybe even a little bit subversive, like the source says, but in the best possible way.
I like that framing, subversive in a good way.
Okay, so let's kick things off by looking at what seems to be that kind of gravitational pull towards the default mode in the training world. Our source material opens with a scenario that probably feels instantly recognizable to many of you listening. You got a client, Harold,
Oh, yeah.
approaches a designer, Tina. Harold has 97 slides, 97,
Wow.
specifically about sharp safety. And his request is pretty straightforward. Turn these slides into an online course.
And Tina's immediate reaction, almost automatic, isn't it? Sure, Harold, I can turn your 97 slides into an online course.
Yep, done.
And that interaction, as the source points out so clearly, is the absolute embodiment of what it calls the school model being applied, often inappropriately, to the workplace.
The school model, okay, we hear that term, but let's really dig into what that mindset involves. What does it mean in practice?
Well, at its core, the school model operates under a very simple, often completely unexamined assumption. The primary goal, sometimes the only goal, is just to transfer knowledge.
Right. The thinking is ignorance is the problem, people don't know something.
Exactly. Therefore, the solution must be information. Just give them the knowledge, tell them the stuff, problem solved.
So we, as designers, and critically, our clients, who are also products of the exact same school system,
Absolutely.
we get caught up in this mental space, this cloud of knowledge, as the source puts it. We're kind of floating up there, maybe a bit removed from the actual challenges people face on the ground,
Yeah, disconnected.
just sort of raining information down from Harold's 97 slides.
Right. We're not looking down at the rocks they have to climb over in their actual work days.
Yeah.
The practical difficulties, the environment, the clunky software, the workflow issues.
No.
We're just assuming, hey, if we provide the information from these slides, the problem, whatever it is, will magically go away.
And it's not just a random thing that we fall into this pattern. The source suggests this mindset is really deeply ingrained. Formal instructional design training, reading many of the sort of foundational texts in the field.
Yeah, the classics.
Even just soaking up the rules and best practices on the job often teach principles that sound remarkably like rules from, well, school.
Absolutely. And think about the common emphasis on things like the most important measure of success is a knowledge assessment score.
Right, the test score.
Or that analysis is primarily about just gathering content to put into the training. Or that content should be meticulously broken down into, facts, concepts, procedures.
Little digestible chunks.
Little chunks, exactly. The focus is on knowledge acquisition or deepening knowledge or creating knowledge. Chunking information is key to prevent cognitive overload. Assessments should immediately follow learning objectives to reinforce retention.
These all sound perfectly reasonable in an academic context.
They are. They're perfectly valid principles for structured academic learning. But they become really problematic when we just blindly apply them to the complex, often messy reality of the workplace without questioning them.
And it's a cycle, isn't it? The clients we work with, they grew up in the same school system. So as adults in a business context, they naturally expect training to function like teaching did in school because, honestly, what else are they supposed to imagine?
It's their only reference point. Often.
Their expectation is simple. You deliver the information, and then you test me to see if I retained it. Did it stick?
Which brings us right to the major fundamental problems that pop up when we just blindly apply this school model framework to the business world. Problem number one, and it's a big one, it's not a test, it's a job.
Right. That's a key phrase. In school, the entire system is built around measuring success by test scores.
It is.
Getting a high score is the explicit goal. It makes teachers happy, parents happy, administrators happy. Countries even compare themselves based on standardized test results. The metric is the score.
But in the job world, our goal is not, or at least shouldn't be, for someone to just pass a test.
No.
Our goal is to change what people actually do on the job. The source gives a really relatable example. A customer service representative.
Okay.
They might have sat through a workshop on empathy and customer interactions. Maybe they even passed a quiz on what empathy is and why it's important.
Yeah.
They know they should use empathy.
They can define it, maybe give examples.
Right. But when an irate caller is actually screaming insults and making personal attacks, all that abstract knowledge, all that knowing about empathy, it can completely go out the window.
Because they have no practice, right?
Yeah.
No practice applying it in that tough, realistic situation.
Exactly. They haven't built the muscle memory for it under fire. They mastered the concept in what the source calls test land, but they can't perform the action when it truly matters in the messy reality of the job.
Or think about those engineers. We want to design a widget that actually works at high altitudes.
Mm-hmm.
We don't ultimately care if they can just regurgitate facts about atmospheric pressure on a multiple choice test. We care if they can apply that knowledge, combine it with other skills, and actually design a functional product that doesn't fail.
Right. The doing is what matters. And the school model, because it fixates on just memorizing information, it sends us down entirely the wrong path sometimes. As the source points out, we end up in these endless, frankly, pretty unproductive debates about the absolute best way to present content for memorization.
Oh, yeah. Is this principle easier to memorize if we use a graphic or maybe a click-to-reveal interaction?
Exactly. Instead of asking a far more relevant question, how can we help people apply this principle effectively in a realistic situation they'll actually face on the job?
And this leads directly to the second major problem the source points out. This widespread belief that a course, any course, is automatically a cure for any performance issue.
The magic bullet.
Yeah. Even if some kind of training is part of the solution, people need more than just a one-time injection of information, right?
Absolutely. They need time, they need practice, they often need support back in their actual work environment to develop new habits and sustain any kind of behavior change. A one-time webinar on a new procedure, for instance, it's just not going to magically fix an inefficient underlying process that makes following the procedure nearly impossible. Or that user-hostile software that people actively avoid using because it's so clunky. Or those impossible deadlines that create overwhelming pressure and basically force people to take shortcuts.
Because those things, the inefficient process, the bad software, the crazy deadlines, they're often the real fundamental causes of the performance problems that initially triggered the request for training in the first place.
Precisely. The source mentions using a specific slow chart tool with an action mapping, precisely to help uncover these real causes and, critically, potentially help us avoid creating unnecessary training altogether if the root cause isn't actually a lack of knowledge or skill.
Which saves everyone time and money.
A huge amount.
Yeah.
And then there's the third problem the source highlights, what it calls this irrational cling to information.
Okay, what does that mean?
Because we've been conditioned to believe training is primarily knowledge transfer, we start treating information itself as inherently valuable, almost precious, like it's gold.
Something to be carefully collected, organized, polished.
Presented beautifully, yeah.
Yeah.
We operate under this implicit assumption that people are essentially blank slates who can't be trusted to figure things out or choose what information they need.
Right. So we feel compelled to just dump everything on them, just in case. Cover all the bases.
Cover everything. It's the opposite of treating learners as intelligent, capable adults who are actually trying to do a job effectively.
Yeah, it's almost disrespectful in a way.
It can feel that way. And while the source acknowledges that good instructional design should strive to go beyond this, the reality is that the present and test approach, so deeply rooted in this school model, has unfortunately been the dominant paradigm for decades in both educational and corporate settings.
It's the comfortable, familiar default, isn't it? Even when the evidence clearly shows it's often pretty ineffective for changing actual on-the-job behavior.
It's the easy path, but often the wrong one.
So to really illustrate the stark difference between this conventional approach and the alternative, the source introduces this narrative. It uses two fictional designers faced with Harold's 97 slides on sharp safety.
Right. On one hand, we have Tina Tichelo.
Tina Tichelo, okay.
She embodies the conventional school model approach. Her focus immediately goes to the content. How do I structure those 97 slides into a logical course?
How do I chunk it? What quiz questions should I write?
Exactly. Her success metric will likely be whether learners complete the course and pass the quiz at the end. Check the box.
And then we have Anna Action von Map.
Anna represents the action mapping approach. Her initial reaction isn't, how do I turn these slides into a course? It's something more like, okay, Harold has a problem related to sharp safety. How could I help him solve that problem?
So the 97 slides are just input, potential information.
Exactly. They're just one potential source of information. But the starting point isn't the slides. It's the problem Harold is trying to solve.
And understanding that fundamental difference in their starting points, Tina versus Anna, that's really key to getting your head around the whole action mapping mindset, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It changes everything that follows.
So we've picked apart the problems with the traditional school model, this idea of training as just transferring knowledge. It's pretty clear that approach often misses the mark in the real world of work.
Yeah, falls short.
So what is this alternative then, this action mapping approach that Anna, our fictional designer, uses?
Well, at a very high level, the source initially outlines two main steps to get started. Step 1, write the goal for your project. But, and this is crucial, this isn't a training goal, like deliver a course.
Okay.
This means committing right up front to a specific, measurable business performance goal. By framing your project this way, you immediately signal to everyone involved, your client, your SMEs, your team, that your role isn't just about creating training deliverables.
And not just a course factory.
Exactly. Your role is about solving a problem that actually matters to the organization's bottom line. And your success will be measured by whether you move that specific business metric.
Okay, so the goal isn't create a course that gets 90% completion, or even learners will be able to describe the 5 steps of sharp safety. It's something much more concrete, like reduce needle stick injuries by X%.
Exactly. It's tied directly to a tangible business result. Then, step 2, following right on from that, ask 2 critical questions. First, what do people need to do differently to achieve that business goal?
The actions.
The actions, yes. And second, why aren't they doing it already? This is where you shift the focus away from abstract knowledge and onto the specific, observable behaviors people need to perform on the job. And then, crucially, you systematically investigate the root causes of why those actions aren't currently being performed effectively.
Focusing on those actions, and especially that why, that sounds like it would immediately broaden the scope of potential solutions way beyond just building a course, right?
It absolutely does. That analysis step is where the magic happens, really. It's where you uncover the real obstacles. It might reveal that the problem isn't a lack of knowledge at all. It might be an issue with a tool they're using, or a bottleneck in a process, or a lack of motivation driven by the work environment, or something else entirely.
And if the problem isn't primarily a knowledge gap,
then training isn't the primary solution. Or maybe it's only a small part of a much bigger solution.
So, action mapping in a nutshell. If you had to boil it down, what are the core tenets?
The source puts it very succinctly. 1, decide to improve business performance. That's your starting point and your ultimate measure of success.
Got it. Business first.
2, Focus on what people need to do, the actions, not just what they need to know.
Actions over information.
3, solve problems. Don't just train around them or assume training is always the answer. Find the root cause.
Solve the real problem.
4, design experiences realistic practice, not just presentations of information.
Experiences, not info dumps.
And 5, training doesn't have to be an event. It could be ongoing support, job aids, spaced practice, maybe stuff embedded right in the workflow.
That last point feels huge. Training doesn't have to be an event. That instantly challenges the default assumption that every training request, like Harold's for the Sharps safety course, automatically means building a traditional course or workshop package.
It fundamentally changes the conversation you have with your stakeholders. And it's important to clarify what action mapping isn't, because the source warns against a common misunderstanding.
Okay, what's the trap?
Some people might see the mapping part and mistakenly teach action mapping as just a visual way to, like, organize content or brainstorm training ideas, sort of like a free-form mind map.
I can see how that might happen.
But that approach completely skips that critical analysis step, the why aren't they doing it part. It just assumes content is the solution from the get-go.
And if you skip that analysis, what's the inevitable result? You just end up...
You end up with unfocused, bloated, and often completely unnecessary training. A real action map might look visual, sure, but it's not just a brainstorm. It has strict dependencies rooted in that business goal. Every single element you consider putting into a solution, every piece of knowledge, every activity idea has to justify its existence
Ow.
by directly supporting that core business performance goal. If it doesn't help people do the thing that achieves the goal, it's out.
So it's not just organizing information, it's actually ruthlessly eliminating information and activities that don't directly serve the goal.
Precisely. It's subtractive as much as additive, and the map itself isn't just a blueprint for training. It also serves as a repository, a place to store notes about why the problem is happening, and potential non-training solutions that could address those root causes. That documentation of the analysis is absolutely key.
Why go through this seemingly more involved process, though? Why bother with all this analysis when just taking Harold's slides and making a course seems, on the surface, faster?
It might feel like more work on the initial analysis, yes, I'll grant you that. But the benefits listed in the source are incredibly compelling, both for the organization and, honestly, for you, the designer. First, it's described as subversive, in a good way.
Subversive. That's a strong word for training design. Tell me more.
It is, but it gets at how this approach helps change the fundamental perception of training within an organization and, just as importantly, how you are viewed as the designer. You shift the nature of the conversation.
How so?
Instead of passively accepting a request like, we need training on X, you reframe it. You say, okay, it sounds like you have a performance problem related to X. Can I help you figure out the best way to solve that problem?
So you move from training is the best solution, being the default assumption.
Right, to something like, let's really look at the problem first. Maybe this tool people are using is just really difficult to use. Could we improve the tool instead of training everyone on how to wrestle with a bad tool?
Or you challenge the default from tell them everything and then test if they remember it.
And the info dump.
To how can we help them learn from realistic experience and actually apply what they've learned directly on the job? You push back on the make sure to cover my favorite piece of information request from the SME.
Oh, that happens.
With actually, based on our analysis of what they need to do, they don't need to know that specific detail to perform the required action effectively.
Exactly. You shift from thinking of training as always being a one-time event
For workshop, the course launch,
to considering how can we provide ongoing support or embed practice directly within their daily workflow. And hopefully for the learner, it changes their reaction from, ugh, I have to take this mandatory training.
the eye roll.
The eye roll, exactly. To something more like, wait a minute, this is actually an interesting challenge that directly relates to my real job.
That's a pretty radical shift in perception, isn't it, for everyone involved?
It truly is. Another major benefit the source highlights is how well subject matter experts or SMEs and clients respond once they actually grasp the concept.
They get it.
They really do. When you focus the conversation not on just organizing content, but on concrete performance and specific activities like, okay, what should they actually do right here in this situation? They quickly understand what you're trying to achieve.
Because it's practical, it's tangible.
It is. And this makes collaboration far easier and, as the source notes, results in solutions that are rich with useful, job-relevant activities, rather than just being bloated with potentially irrelevant information dumps.
And I would imagine that efficiency and collaboration and that sharp focus saves a lot of time and churn downstream.
Absolutely, which leads directly to the next significant benefit. You save money. Real money.
How so?
The source states that it has seen action mapping save organizations significant amounts, often by completely avoiding the creation of unnecessary or ineffective training altogether. That initial analysis might take a bit more time than just accepting Herald's slides at face value, but it's a powerful investment. It helps you identify the true root cause of a performance problem and find the most efficient solution, which, again, is rarely just dumping all available information into a standard course format.
So the slightly deeper dive up front in analysis prevents the far greater cost of building the wrong thing, rolling it out, and then realizing months later it didn't actually move the needle on the business problem at all.
Precisely. Wasted effort, wasted budget. It also allows you to create really targeted training when training is determined to be part of the solution. Because you've analyzed the specific actions and root causes, any training you design is highly focused, incredibly relevant, and activity-based. It concentrates only on the minimum necessary information and the maximum relevant practice needed for people to do something differently to achieve that business goal. That means far less extraneous content, fewer slides, shorter lectures, and more memorable, compactful, and efficient learning experiences.
Because people remember doing things and the consequences of their actions far better than they remember passively sitting through a presentation.
Right. Absolutely. Retention and application go way up. And finally, the source emphasizes it just makes people happy.
Happy? How?
Well, clients are happier because they see real, measurable results tied to their business goals. They feel they've invested wisely, not just checked a training box. Learners are happier because they're challenged, they're respected as intelligent adults, and they see the direct relevance of the activities to their jobs, instead of being bored by information dumps or patronized with content they already know or don't need.
And what about the designer? You.
And for you, the training designer. Designers who adopt this approach report gaining the respect they deserve. They're seen as valuable strategic partners, not just order takers. And they enjoy their jobs more because they're solving real problems and making a tangible impact they can actually see.
It paints a really compelling picture of a happy ending, doesn't it? Compared to the usual frustrations.
It truly does. Where you, the designer, are no longer just an order taker building courses on demand, but a respected performance consultant. Your SME is proud because their expertise was used to build practical, effective solutions that actually work. Learners are engaged, challenged, and confidently applying new skills to solve problems they encounter daily. And the organization sees measurable, positive improvements in the key metrics that truly matter to their success. It's a win-win-win.
Okay, that sounds like a much more impactful role and a much better outcome, but how do we actually get there?
Yeah.
What does putting action mapping into practice step by step actually look like on the ground?
Right, the practicalities. Well, it all starts with that absolutely crucial first step we mentioned earlier, defining the goal.
Right, and just to reiterate, this is the business goal, not the training goal. That's the key distinction.
Exactly. The source is really adamant about this. When a client comes to you asking for training, they always have a bigger underlying goal in mind, the real business reason they initiated the project in the first place, even if they don't articulate it that way initially.
So your goal statement has to capture that.
Yes. It should commit everyone involved, you, the client, the SMEs, to improving business performance. And it absolutely must be measurable in a way that is meaningful to the organization, ideally tied to a metric they already care about and track.
The source offers a very practical template for this, doesn't it? To help structure that conversation.
Yes, it's a great starting point, very useful. A measure we already use will increase, decrease specific number or percentage by specific date as people do specific action.
A measure we already use. That feels significant. Why the emphasis on using an existing measure?
For two main reasons, really. First, it's just practical. If they're already measuring it, you don't need to invent a whole new tracking system or try to convince them to start collecting brand new data, which can be a big hurdle.
Good point. Less friction.
Second, and perhaps more strategically important, the very fact that an organization is already measuring something usually means it's a key performance indicator, KPI they care deeply about. It matters to leadership. By tying your project directly to that existing metric, you immediately align your work with what matters most to the business leaders.
Smart. So how do you navigate that initial conversation? Let's go back to that TPS report scenario from the source. A client asks for training on how to create TPS reports. How do you use this framework to redirect?
You start by gently redirecting the conversation away from the requested solution, training, and towards the underlying problem and the desired outcome. You might ask something like, okay, you need training on TPS reports. That's helpful to know. What are you hoping will be different after this training? What specific problem are you trying to solve by improving TPS reports?
Trying to get behind the request.
Exactly. The client might respond, well, people need to create better TPS reports because way too many of them are getting rejected by the processing department, and that's causing serious delays downstream.
Rejected reports. Ding, ding, ding. There's a potential metric right there.
Exactly. So you follow up immediately. Okay, rejected reports. Is the rejection rate something you currently measure? Do you track that number? If they say yes, fantastic, you've likely found your core metric. If not, you ask for related measures. Okay, if not the rejection rate itself, are there specific errors in the reports that lead to rejections? Do you measure the number of errors, or maybe the number of client complaints related to these delays? You keep probing gently until you find any existing metric connected to the performance issue.
And then you start plugging the specifics into that template.
Yes. Do you have a target in mind for reducing that rejection rate? How much do you realistically need to reduce it by? Let's say they say we need to cut it by 20%. Okay, great. You can even start writing the goal out visually if you're meeting in person. The TPS report rejection rate will decrease by 20%.
Making it concrete.
Then you ask about the timeline. You mentioned this is causing delays now, which sounds urgent. Is there a date by which you'd ideally like to see that 20% decrease achieved? Add the date by the end of the next quarter.
And finally, you have to add the as people do something part, connecting it back to the actual job performance that needs to change.
Right. You clarify who needs to do what. You mentioned this project is for the report clerks who create these reports, is that right? So the goal is for them to create reports that are consistently accurate and accepted by processing, correct? Then you add that final piece to the goal statement. The TPS report rejection rate will decrease by 20% by the end of the next quarter as report clerks consistently create accurate, accepted reports.
That whole process sounds like it gently but relentlessly steers the client away from just asking for a course and back towards articulating the real business outcome they need in measurable terms.
And that is precisely the point. You're not just taking an order, you're helping them clarify their own objectives in a way that's measurable, actionable, and impactful for the business. The source makes it crystal clear why a goal like completion rates for the new safety course will reach 90% by next year as staff complete the course is so problematic.
Yeah, because honestly, who outside the training department or maybe HR truly cares about course completion rates? It doesn't directly impact the business bottom line.
Exactly. It's an internal training metric, a vanity metric sometimes, not a business metric. And more critically, that kind of goal completely bypasses and short-circuits the essential analysis needed to understand the actual safety problem that prompted the request for a safety course in the first place.
Right. It makes the delivery of the course the end goal, not fixing the performance problem the course is supposedly intended to address. Huge difference.
It's focusing on the output, the course, instead of the outcome. Safer behaviors, fewer incidents.
The source also makes a good point about making the goal more meaningful by connecting it to the client's personal values or what they specifically care about within the organization. And looking for more frequent specific measures, like maybe a weekly observation checklist tied to a new manager behavior that can provide much more actionable feedback on progress towards a larger business goal that might take longer to actually budge.
Absolutely. That focus on frequent observable measures is really key for tracking progress and demonstrating value along the way, keeping momentum going. The widget salesperson example from the source is another brilliant illustration of how profoundly the initial goal definition impacts the entire project and its ultimate outcome.
Yeah, let's walk through that one again, maybe contrasting the two approaches based purely on the goal setting.
Okay, so imagine a sales manager. Let's call him Bob again. Bob feels his team isn't selling enough of the high-profit mega and monster widgets. They're focusing too much on the small stuff. Now, if Bob frames the goal in the traditional school model way, it might be something like, salespeople will know all the features of the mega and monster widgets.
Focus on knowledge.
Pure knowledge acquisition. With that goal, Bob will inevitably create e-learning that simply presents feature lists, compares specs, maybe throws in some knowledge checks on remembering those facts.
A classic information dump followed by testing recall, the Tina Teach-a-Lot approach.
Exactly. Now imagine Bob follows the action mapping approach. He defines the goal based on the actual business problem. Mega and Monster widget sales will increase by 5% by Q4 as salespeople effectively identify the best widget solution for each customer's specific needs.
Ah, totally different. That goal immediately requires salespeople to do something different on the job.
Right. They need to effectively identify customer needs and then match those needs to the right products, but specifically the bigger widgets. It's about action and application.
And that new goal, focused squarely on action and business results, naturally pushes you to ask that crucial question. Why aren't they doing that already?
Precisely. And in the sources example, the analysis uncovered the real obstacles. It wasn't that they didn't know the features. It was things like the commission structure heavily favored selling lots of smaller, cheaper widgets, making it financially irrational to push the bigger ones, an environmental motivational issue.
Okay, yeah.
And maybe salespeople were laser-focused on beating competitors on the cheapest widget price rather than selling value, a motivational strategy issue.
Right.
These aren't knowledge gaps about product features.
So the analysis reveals these root causes that training alone, especially feature training, just cannot fix.
Right. And this leads to a completely different kind of solution. It's not just a course on product features. The solution includes non-training elements, like potentially changing the commission structure, or having sales managers explicitly coach and focus on market share for larger widgets, not just unit volume.
Addressing the environmental and motivational factors first.
Yes. And the training that is developed is highly focused and practice-based. Its activities centered around practicing asking the right diagnostic questions to truly identify customer needs, and then practicing articulating the value proposition of the larger widgets in response to those needs.
And it's not a one-off event.
No. In the example, it's delivered through maybe some online activities for spaced practice, reinforced through quarterly role plays with managers. It's embedded into their ongoing workflow and development, not just a single course they take and forget.
That example really drives home how defining the right goal up front, the business goal focused on action, completely transforms the project. It shifts it from being a passive information exercise to a blended strategic approach tackling the actual root causes with targeted practice-based solutions.
It's a perfect case study in the power of starting with that clear, business-focused, action-oriented goal. It sets the direction for everything else.
Okay, so once that measurable business goal is clearly defined, the next critical step is identifying precisely what people need to do to achieve it.
The actions.
This is where you need to be laser focused on specific observable behaviors that happen on the job, the concrete do something part of your goal statement we just talked about.
And this is another major point of divergence from the school model. The source draws a really clear distinction between these observable on-the-job actions and what it calls test words.
Test words, like
Identify, list, describe, or explain. These words often describe knowledge acquisition that happens internally, in their head, or activities that only really occur in the artificial environment of a test, what the source playfully calls test land.
Right. So while a firefighter certainly needs to be able to identify the correct techniques for putting out different types of fires,
Of course.
the action we ultimately care about in a real emergency isn't their ability to list techniques on paper. It's them quickly and effectively extinguishing the fire using the right technique.
It's exactly. Identify techniques is enabling knowledge. It's information they absolutely need to support the action, but it's not the action itself. And if you only focus your training objectives on enabling knowledge like identify, you end up, again, with information presentations followed by quizzes that test short-term memory of those techniques in an abstract way without ever giving people practice applying them in the pressurized, chaotic, real-world context of an actual fire.
And these actions need to be specific, right?
Yeah.
Not just vague platitudes like be ethical.
Absolutely. A broad statement like avoid the appearance of impropriety is a desired outcome, sure, but it's not a specific action. What does someone actually do day to day to achieve it? You need to break it down into observable behavior.
Like the example in the source.
Yeah, the source gives a great example. A specific action might be something like, when offered a gift valued at more than 100 euros by a potential client in Zekostan, politely reject the gift using culturally sensitive methods X, Y, and Z as outlined in the company's gift policy.
Okay, that's something concrete. It's specific, observable, you can practice it, you can give feedback on it.
Right. You might list several of these specific sub-actions under the broader, perhaps vaguer, expectation like maintain ethical standards. And when defining these actions, it's also crucial to ask about the standards of performance. How well does the action need to be performed to be considered successful?
The quality aspect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The clinic improvement plan example from the source illustrates this perfectly. The international aid workers weren't failing to write the plans. They were performing that basic action. The problem was the plans weren't written well enough.
They weren't useful.
Right. They were too academic, too long, too theoretical to actually be useful and implementable by the understaffed clinic operators on the ground.
So the real action needed wasn't just write a clinic improvement plan, it was implicitly write a useful, concise, implementable clinic improvement plan that meets standard X, Y, and Z. The standard is actually part of defining the successful action.
Precisely. You're focusing on the observable behavior and the required level of performance for that behavior to actually contribute meaningfully to the overall business goal.
Okay, makes sense. So once you have the business goal defined and the key actions identified, what people should be doing, and to what standard, the third and perhaps most critical step in this whole process is asking, why aren't they doing it already?
Yes, this is the absolute heart of the analysis phase, the diagnosis.
And this is where you systematically investigate the root causes of that performance gap, right? You don't just guess or assume it's lack of knowledge.
Exactly. You don't jump to solutions. The source mentions using a specific flowchart tool, a structured process, to guide this investigation. You're exploring potential categories of causes. And it's often surprising how quickly you can uncover useful insights just by systematically asking probing why. Questions about the actions you identified earlier. Why is this step being missed? Why are they using the old form?
And the source strongly recommends starting this investigation with a specific branch of potential causes, one that's often overlooked if you immediately jump to, they need training.
Yes, absolutely. Start with the environment branch. And there's a very strategic reason for starting there.
Which is?
As the source points out, it's actually quite rare to find a significant performance problem that doesn't have a substantial environmental component contributing to it. And here's the kicker. Fixing these non-training environmental issues can often significantly reduce or even entirely eliminate the need for formal training.
Wow. So you start with the environment because addressing issues there might fix the problem directly, or at least clear major obstacles that would prevent any training, no matter how good, from being effective anyway.
Exactly. It helps shift the conversation with the client away from that automatic assumption of, oh, it's a people problem, they just need training, and really opens their minds and yours to other possibilities first.
What are some examples of these environmental problems?
Oh, the source lists many, and they're often really impactful. Things like a bad tool that constantly malfunctions or is incredibly difficult to use, like an old locking up widget wrangler machine mentioned. Critical information that's hard to find, buried in a terrible intranet or written in dense jargon, a confusing, outdated manual. Pressure from deadlines, or a negative workplace culture that actively discourages the desired behavior, like don't ask too many questions. People being effectively punished for doing things well, like getting all the tedious extra work dumped on you if you finish your main tasks quickly.
Oh, that's demotivating.
Totally. Information hoarding that prevents essential knowledge sharing between colleagues. Or maybe simply having the wrong person hired for the job in the first place, someone who genuinely lacks the innate physical or mental capacity required for the necessary actions.
These are powerful external factors completely outside the individual's knowledge or even their immediate motivation, right?
They are. And as the source quotes Kinley and Ben-Hur, the work context acts like a life support machine for any new behavior you're trying to instill. The contextual factors in the work environment are often more influential than the quality of the training itself in determining whether someone can and will apply what they learned back on the job.
That's a huge statement. Context is king.
Pretty much. Starting the analysis with the environment branch helps ensure these critical factors aren't missed right at the start, and asking that why chain repeatedly can lead you right back there. Why are the widget wranglers failing? Why don't they know how to handle the tool? Well, maybe the hiring process isn't assessing the required dexterity. Or maybe the tool itself is fundamentally flawed, and that's the real problem we should be fixing.
Okay, so after thoroughly exploring the environment, where do you typically move next in the analysis?
Next is off of the knowledge branch. Now, this is where, as we noted earlier, most clients initially believe the entire problem lies.
Right, they just don't know how to do it. That's the common refrain.
That's the default assumption. But even here, within the knowledge category, you need to keep asking those probing why questions to really understand the nature of the knowledge gap. It's rarely simple ignorance.
What kind of questions help you dig deeper into the knowledge aspect?
The source provides a great set of prompts here. Things like, Do people even know they should perform this action? Is the expectation clear? Do they know precisely how to do it correctly? Do they know the required standard, how well it needs to be done to be successful? Do they understand why the action is important, how it connects to the bigger picture or affects others? Is it possible they think they know how to do it, but they actually have incorrect or outdated information?
That happens a lot.
It does. Or do they know the information, maybe they can pass a test on it, but they consistently fail to apply it on the job?
Yeah.
And if so, why? Is it the environment again? Is it a lack of practice? And if they genuinely don't know, why don't they know? Is the manual too confusing? Which loops back to environment. Were they taught before, but maybe the training was terrible, there was no follow-up, so it didn't stick? And maybe the most important question, even if they know the information now, will they actually be able to apply it under real-world conditions and pressure?
These questions really push you far beyond a simple binary of they know or they don't know. It gets into the complexities of knowledge, application, retention, and all the factors that prevent knowledge from turning into action.
Exactly. The Shores safety example illustrates this well. Tina, the conventional designer, just takes Herald's slides, which are essentially standard operating procedure content, and assumes the problem is simply that staff don't know the procedures.
Standard school model thinking.
Right. Anna, using action mapping, accepts the slides, but then immediately asks for more context. She asks for photos of existing warning signs related to Sharp's safety in the workplace and copies of any job aids people currently use.
Why does she do that?
She's trying to understand the actual issues people are facing on the job. Are the warning signs hard to see or confusing? Are the job aids too complex, hidden away, or inaccessible when needed? This hints at potential environmental problems or issues with accessing or applying the knowledge in the crucial moment, not just a simple lack of knowing the core SOPs documented in the slides.
Got it. Then there's the motivation branch of the analysis. How does that fit in?
Motivation is incredibly important, obviously, and it's often very closely tied to the environment we just discussed. As the source emphasizes, poor tools, ineffective or demoralizing management practices, or a negative organizational culture are frequently the biggest drivers of low motivation. It's usually not some inherent laziness in the individual employee.
Can you give us some examples of how these motivation issues might manifest in the workplace, based on the source?
Sure, things like actively refusing to use a tool because it's old, stiff, and difficult to operate, even if they technically know how. Not feeling motivated to follow a tedious bureaucratic procedure if you don't understand its importance or see how your individual effort contributes to larger goals, why bother?
That makes sense.
Seeing colleagues who go the extra mile and develop new skills get burdened with more work or unpleasant tasks as a reward, which creates a clear disincentive for others to improve. A general lack of recognition or reward for good performance, why try harder if no one notices or cares? Feeling a clash between your personal values and the organization's actions or priorities.
Yeah.
Not having your suggestions or concerns heard or acted upon, leading to learned helplessness and disengagement. Or being stuck in a team or organizational culture where coworkers actively undermine or resent those who try to excel in anti-achievement culture.
Wow. These are powerful forces that training alone cannot possibly overcome, right? You can't train away a toxic culture or a fundamental lack of respect or recognition.
Precisely. If the environment or the organizational culture actively demotivates the desired behavior, no amount of training sessions or e-learning modules will make people do it consistently over the long term. You have to address the motivational root causes, which are often systemic.
Finally, the source mentions the skill branch in the analysis framework. What does that cover?
Yeah, this branch looks at whether people have the innate physical or mental capacity required to perform the action successfully. Is the core problem that they literally lack the necessary manual dexterity, the required reaction speed, the physical strength, or maybe the cognitive processing ability needed for the job, completely, regardless of their knowledge or motivation?
So it's about inherent capability.
Exactly. This wasn't detailed quite as much as the other branches in the source material we reviewed, but the core idea is important. Some performance problems stem from a lack of inherent ability or aptitude, not just gaps in knowledge or motivation or a bad environment. If someone simply isn't physically capable of lifting a certain weight required for a task, training them on how to lift it properly won't solve the fundamental problem.
You might need a different solution.
Right. You might need an assistive tool, which is an environmental solution, or perhaps you need a different person in that specific role, which relates to skill assessment and job fit selection.
The TPS reports example is a great way to see how these different branches of analysis, environment, knowledge, motivation, skill can interact in a real scenario. The problem is rejected reports because clerks are entering client last names incorrectly, especially complex Hispanic names with multiple last names. Asking why doesn't just stop at the obvious, they don't know how.
Right. You dig deeper. You discover it's maybe not just a lack of knowing the correct format, but a knowledge application issue.
Yeah.
They might know there can be multiple names, but how do they figure out which one are ones to actually use in this specific database field? This difficulty might be compounded by a tool limitation. Perhaps the database field itself only accepts one last name string, creating a technical barrier and an environmental issue.
Okay.
There might also be a lack of a crystal clear, simple standard or readily accessible job aid for how to handle this specific common situation, the knowledge access job aid issue. And almost certainly, there's likely been a lack of sufficient practice applying that standard to diverse, tricky examples, which is a skill application or practice issue.
And the solutions that emerge from that deeper, multifaceted analysis reflect this blended understanding of the root causes, right? It's not just one thing.
Exactly. The solution isn't just sending everyone to a course reminding them about Hispanic naming conventions. It might include improving the database interface, maybe adding a pop-up hint that guides them when certain codes are entered. That's an environment fix. It definitely includes providing a crystal clear, super easy to access standard or job aid that tells them exactly what to do in that situation, addressing the knowledge job aid gap. And crucially, it includes designing a specific targeted practice activity where clerks get realistic practice identifying and entering complex last names correctly into the actual system, or a simulation of it, addressing the skill application practice gap. You're tackling the problem from multiple angles identified during the analysis.
Makes total sense. After analyzing the problem and identifying these potential causes across the different branches, you then prioritize, right? You focus on the actions that are most critical to achieving your business goal.
You can't boil the ocean.
You focus your design efforts on the behaviors that contribute the most to the desired outcome, or are currently performed incorrectly most often, or maybe have the most significant negative consequences if they're messed up.
Find the vital few.
And the source adds a practical note about audience here. Avoid trying to analyze and design for multiple distinct audiences within a single project unless you are truly prepared and have the budget and time to create separate, targeted solutions for each specific role. It's usually better to focus the project tightly on the primary audience if possible.
Yeah, keep the scope manageable and focused. It's about finding those vital few actions and their true root causes for your main target group, and then focusing your energy there for maximum impact and efficiency.
Okay, so you've navigated the analysis, you have a clear, measurable business goal, you know the key actions people need to perform to reach it and to what standard, and you've dug deep to understand why they aren't performing them effectively, identifying root causes across environment, knowledge, motivation, and maybe even skill. What comes next? How do you move from analysis to solution?
Right. This is where the focus shifts to actually designing the solutions. And here's the key insight from action mapping. If training is determined to be part of that solution, and remember, it might not be, or it might be a small part, then you are designing experiences, not just presenting information. The source provides really strong, almost counterintuitive advice here. You should brainstorm and prototype activities first, then worry about writing the supporting content or building presentations.
Wait, so you're saying you consciously ignore the client's initial request for a course or some e-learning at this stage, even if that's what they asked for?
Absolutely, yes. At least in your internal design process, you need to momentarily set aside the requested format and focus purely on designing the specific kinds of activities that will help people do the job differently, effectively addressing the root causes you uncovered in your analysis. What will help them practice the necessary actions.
And the core of this entire approach revolves around the practice activity. The source lays out 4 absolutely crucial requirements for a practice activity to be truly effective in a work context, not just a knowledge check.
Yes, these 4 are basically non-negotiable if you want to build skills that transfer back to the job. 1, it must require a decision. The activity must ask people to decide what to do in a given situation, not just show what they know or remember. It's about applying knowledge and making choices under realistic constraints.
Okay, decision-making, what's number 2?
2, it needs context. The activity must place the learner in a specific detailed situation. Give the people involved names, Put them in a specific place, doing specific things that closely mirror their actual work environment. No generic, abstract scenarios floating in a vacuum.
No, learner A needs to. Got it. Needs to feel real.
Exactly. Which leads to number 3. It must have realism. The context isn't a fantasy world or some abstract game show. It must realistically match the learner's actual job. The decision they are asked to make in the activity is one they would genuinely face and potentially struggle with on the job.
Plausible, relevant challenges. And the 4th requirement.
4. There must be consequences. This is huge. When the learner makes a decision in the activity, the feedback they receive must show the realistic consequence of that decision in the simulated work context.
So not just a pop-up saying correct or incorrect, try again.
No, definitely not just that. It should show what would actually happen in real life as a result of their choice. Maybe a negative outcome unfolds, the customer gets angrier, the machine jams, the report gets rejected, maybe a positive one if they chose well. The feedback lets the learner draw their own conclusions from seeing that realistic outcome unfold. You might offer tips or explanations after they've seen the consequence, but the consequence itself is the immediate, impactful feedback mechanism.
Why is this intense focus on realistic practice activities built around these 4 requirements so fundamentally important for workplace learning?
Because, as the source keeps bringing us back to, jobs aren't tests of memory. They're tests of performance under pressure. We need people to be able to apply their knowledge and skills effectively under real-world conditions, often when things are busy, stressful, or ambiguous. Practice activities, designed with these 4 requirements, allow them to do exactly that, but in a safe space where mistakes aren't costly or embarrassing. As the learning expert Ruth Colvin Clark notes, problem-based activities like these give learners crucial opportunities to build the kinds of mental models and complex memory structures, the memory repositories, she calls them, that experts rely on to quickly assess and navigate complex problems they encounter on the job.
So it's about building the cognitive and behavioral muscle memory for effective decision-making in context, not just knowing facts out of context.
Exactly. You're wiring the brain for performance. The source starkly contrasts this kind of realistic practice, like a scenario where Sarah, a specific employee, has to figure out how to save a complex purchase order correctly under specific tricky conditions, with what it calls generic test activities, like maybe dragging and dropping abstract process steps into the correct sequence on screen. That drag and drop activity manipulates abstract information in a way that rarely, if ever, mirrors how you actually perform that process in real life.
Right. It tests your memorization of a list, not your ability to actually perform the steps correctly in a dynamic, realistic situation with potential interruptions or exceptions.
Precisely. And the activity-first approach means you design the activities before you necessarily have all the supporting content written out or finalized. That feels really counterintuitive if you're stuck in the school model. It's a complete flip. You design the challenging activities first, almost assuming people are just plunged into the challenge without preparation, just like they might be on the job sometimes. Then, you figure out what minimal essential information they might need to successfully navigate that activity later.
And how do they get that information?
You might provide that information optionally during the activity, maybe linked as a resource or available on demand via a help button, rather than forcing everyone through a long prerequisite lecture or reading assignment up front. This stream of activities approach, where learning is embedded within the practice itself, naturally steers you away from creating pointless knowledge checks just because they're easy to build. You focus on performance practice.
And if training is needed, based on the analysis, it's often about creating these highly targeted practice activities, which don't automatically have to be packaged as a single traditional course event.
Right. The solution might be a series of short, practice-based online modules delivered over time, maybe embedded right into their workflow system. It can be a series of structured role plays with feedback. It could even incorporate structured on-the-job learning methods, like shadowing checklists or pairing with experienced mentors for specific tasks. Training becomes a targeted tool in the performance improvement toolbox, used specifically to support the needed actions and not always delivered as a formal, contained course.
You also touched on formats earlier, mentioning that the common reasons people choose a specific training format, like e-learning versus workshop versus video, are often the wrong reasons.
Absolutely. The source really challenges blindly choosing a format based on things like just client history.
Yeah.
Well, we always do e-learning for compliance. Or a perceived need for a quick fix. A webinar is fast to set up. Or jumping on the latest tech trend. Everyone's doing VR now. We need VR.
Or justifying that expensive authoring tool the company bought last year.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or simply trying to fill an empty slot in a meeting schedule. We have 2 hours free at the all-hands meeting next month. Can you do some training on communication?
Oh, that last one is painfully familiar. Right. Can you just put together something quick on leadership for the Friday meeting?
Exactly. And the source is very firm here. You are the learning and performance expert. It's your professional responsibility to recommend and determine the most effective format for the learners and the specific job context based on your analysis. Not just follow orders or fill arbitrary time slots.
So what should guide the format choice?
While research doesn't really support tailoring formats to speculative learning styles, it does strongly support techniques like spaced practice over time, which argues against one-off events, and ensuring the learning context matches the job context as closely as possible. Different cultures might prefer different interaction styles within an activity, maybe more group discussion versus individual polling, but the fundamental principle remains. Choose the format for each specific activity based on what best allows learners to realistically practice the real-life behavior in a context that mirrors their job.
And giving learners some control within that activity is also a key aspect of this approach, not just marching them through lockstep.
Yes, absolutely. Acknowledging that your audience probably has mixed prior knowledge and learns at different paces is really important for engagement and respect. Giving them control, for example, allowing them to pull up optional supporting information like job aids or detailed procedural steps only when they feel they need it, rather than forcing everyone through the same lengthy introductory presentation, reduces frustration and boredom significantly.
It lets the experienced people skip ahead and the novices get the support they need.
Exactly. And the source references the work of learning experts like Julie Dirksen and the research highlighted in the book Make It Stick. They emphasize that some level of productive struggle, figuring things out, is actually essential for deep, long-lasting learning. Allowing people to grapple with a challenge a bit and then seek help when they're ready makes the learning stick far better than just being passively spoon-fed all the information up front.
And it treats them like intelligent adults who can manage their own learning process. As Kinley and Ben-Hur mention in the source, having higher expectations can actually lead to higher performance. Giving learners control within challenging activities shows you have high expectations for their capability.
Absolutely. It signals respect. Now, what about all that crucial supporting information? The detailed job aids, the lengthy procedures, the underlying concepts, the nitty-gritty policy details, maybe like the content from Harold's original 97 slides of Sharpe's safety information. Where does that fit if we're starting with activities first?
It fits by being available during the activity rather than presented as a prerequisite dump beforehand, right?
Exactly. It's linked or accessible on demand, perhaps through a resource tab or context-sensitive help. So learners can pull precisely what they need, exactly when they need it, to help them make the decision required in the activity. This respects their intelligence and their time. You're not treating them like empty buckets who need to have everything lectured to them before they're allowed to even try something.
And you limit the information.
You limit the pushed information to what's truly required for competent performance on the job. And you consciously divide it into things they can easily look up when needed versus things they absolutely must memorize for immediate recall under pressure.
And if certain information is critical for instant recall, like emergency procedures,
Right.
how do you handle that?
Then you design specific practice activities or use techniques specifically designed to support durable memorization. This might involve mixing targeted drills for recall, like flashcards or quick quizzes focused only on the critical items, with contextual practice activities that require applying that memorized info under simulated pressure. Techniques like spaced repetition, using tools or simple schedules to revisit key info over time, can be very effective for solidifying information, but always tied back to the ultimate need to use that information to perform an action correctly.
Can you give an example from the source?
Sure. The Sharpe safety activity example includes linking directly to a real-life job aid or procedure document that learners can access optionally right when they're facing a tricky decision point in the scenario. Or the Zekistan UFO example, it puts learners in a situation where they immediately need to use some basic foreign language phrases they haven't been formally taught yet, forcing them to actively try and figure things out, maybe accessing linguistic resources provided on demand. That's realistic practice for a job that requires quick thinking and communication in unfamiliar territory.
And debriefs after these activities or scenarios are mentioned as important too.
Yes, debriefs are really valuable, especially after complex scenarios or activities dealing with gray areas where there isn't one single perfectly right answer. They provide a structured opportunity to connect the specific actions taken and the consequences experienced in the activity back to the overarching concepts, principles, or policies. They help learners process what they've experienced, reflect on their decisions, and generalize the lessons learned to other potential situations they might face.
Okay. So once you have your activity ideas prototyped and the supporting information strategy mapped out, the next step is more formal prototyping and refining, right? Getting feedback.
Exactly. This is where you build a simple, working mock-up of your key activity or a core path through it. You might start with just a multiple-choice question presented as a realistic mini-scenario, or maybe map out a simple branching path on paper or using basic software. The initial goal is minimal graphics, no fancy animations or distracting bling yet.
Focus on the core mechanic.
The focus is entirely on the functionality of the activity. Does the decision make sense? Is the context clear? Are the consequences realistic and informative? Does the challenge feel right? And then, critically, you test this rough prototype early and often.
Who do you test it with?
Test it with your SMEs to check the accuracy and realism of the scenario and consequences. Test it with your client or key stakeholders to manage their expectations and show them how this activity-based approach works in practice. It might look different from what they initially pictured. And most importantly, test it with a few actual learners who represent your target audience.
Why is testing with real learners so crucial at this stage?
Because they'll tell you if they understand it, if it's engaging, if it's challenging in the right ways, not too easy, not impossibly hard, and if they feel like they actually learned something useful from the consequences. Their feedback is gold.
This early lo-fi testing phase sounds vital, especially if your design approach looks very different from the traditional slide-based e-learning the client might have been expecting initially.
It is absolutely crucial for getting buy-in and making corrections cheaply. It's much easier and faster to adjust a simple prototype based on feedback than it is to rework a fully produced, polished module later on. For more complex branching scenarios, you also prototype the plot flow, often using a simple flowchart or a specialized diagramming tool to ensure the story branches logically, covers the key mistakes learners are likely to make, and realistically allows for recovery or shows meaningful consequences for those mistakes.
What are some common challenges people face during prototyping? What if the feedback isn't what you expected?
Well, the source notes that sometimes activities come out too easy. This can happen because you, the designer, or maybe the SME, are so familiar with the content that you underestimate how difficult it actually is for someone new to the topic or task. Or perhaps the initial analysis didn't fully uncover what makes the decision really tricky or complex on the job.
So what do you do if it's too easy?
If activities feel too easy based on learner feedback, you might need to revisit your analysis questions, dig deeper into the environmental challenges, or even better, ask the learners themselves. How could we make this more challenging or more realistic based on your experience? They often have great ideas.
And what if it's too hard?
If activities are too hard, which the source suggests is actually rarer, if the initial analysis was thorough, you might need to provide more accessible optional help within the activity. Ensure that earlier activities successfully built the necessary foundational knowledge, or simply check if the wording of the scenario or the choices is confusing or ambiguous. Clarity is key.
Okay. Finally, after prototyping and refining your solution based on feedback, you move into the full implementation and evaluation phases.
Right, and implementation here isn't just about launching the training module or delivering the workshop. It has to be carefully coordinated with any non-training solutions you identified back in the analysis phase.
Like what?
Like, maybe the improved job aid needs to be distributed at the same time the practice activity goes live, or the change in the commission structure needs to be announced just before the sales training on selling bigger widgets begins. Your project outline or plan should be concise, but clearly list all the components of the overall solution training and non-training, and explicitly state who is responsible for implementing each piece by when.
And evaluation, how does that work in this model? It can't just be smile sheets, right?
Definitely not just smile sheets. Evaluation is planned from the very beginning, and it's linked directly back to that specific, measurable business goal you defined in step 1.
So you're measuring if you actually move the needle on the business metric.
That's the ultimate goal, yes. Did the measure we defined, like needle stick injuries, or TPS report rejection rate, or mega widget sales actually increase or decrease by the target percentage by the deadline we set? The source recommends methods like the success case method to help figure this out.
The success case method, how does that work?
It involves actively seeking out and documenting examples of both success and non-success cases after the solution has been implemented. You find individuals or teams who did successfully achieve the desired performance change and adopt the new behaviors, and you also find those who didn't.
And then?
Through surveys and interviews with both groups, you investigate why they succeeded or failed. What helped the successful group? What barriers did the unsuccessful group face? This gives you powerful qualitative data on whether your overall solution, including the training components, the non-training components, the format choices, the environmental changes, actually work to change behavior and impact the business, and crucially, why or why not.
That sounds much more insightful than just completion rates.
Infinitely more insightful. Looking at closer metrics that are tied directly to the new behaviors, like that weekly manager observation checklist we mentioned for new manager behaviors, can also show important progress toward the larger, perhaps slower-moving ultimate business goal. It shows if the immediate actions are changing.
A common challenge here must be clients who, despite all this, still expect that one-time training event, that big launch, to be the silver bullet that solves everything instantly.
It absolutely is a common challenge.
Yeah.
Old habits die hard. However, if you've done a good job involving them throughout the entire action mapping process, getting their input during the analysis, showing them the activity prototypes, demonstrating clearly how the proposed solution addresses the specific root causes you uncovered together, and explaining the research-backed benefits of spaced or embedded activities versus a one-off event, you have a much better chance of getting their buy-in and convincing them to try a different, more effective implementation approach. But if they still insist on just a one-time event, well, sometimes you have to pick your battles. But the evaluation becomes even more critical then. Documenting the non-success cases afterward and analyzing why those individuals didn't achieve the desired performance outcome provides crucial data. You can use that data to show the client objectively why a one-time event might not have been sufficient for achieving complex behavior change, and it builds a much stronger case for future projects to take a different, more sustained approach.
So looking at the bigger picture here, what does this all add up to? What's the ultimate outcome when you successfully implement this action mapping approach from start to finish?
Well, the source summarizes it quite powerfully. You've successfully guided your client and stakeholders to properly analyze the real performance problem, not just jump to solutions. You've likely identified and helped facilitate fixes for environmental or systemic issues that were major obstacles. You've applied training strategically only where it was genuinely needed and likely to be effective.
And the training itself is different.
Completely different. If training was part of the solution, you designed challenging, realistic activities focused on decisions and consequences. You treated learners as capable adults by letting them access information as needed and learned from realistic outcomes, not just lecturing them. You delivered practice activities in the most effective formats based on the job context, potentially including spaced practice or on-demand resources embedded in their workflow. And critically, you've evaluated the project's success based on its measurable impact on the actual business goal, not just on irrelevant internal training metrics or how much people liked it.
It sounds like that initial analysis meeting takes longer than just taking Harold's 97 slides and saying, sure, I can make a course out of this. Does that mean the entire project takes longer overall using action mapping?
That's a common concern, but the source argues strongly against it. While the initial analysis meeting might take, say, an hour or two, compared to maybe a 5-minute content handoff in the traditional model,
Right.
it saves significant time and money in the long run.
How does it achieve that saving? It seems counterintuitive.
By avoiding the massive waste involved in creating entirely useless training. The source mentions projects where that initial analysis completely changed the direction, preventing the team from spending months building the wrong training for the wrong audience based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the real problem. That's a huge saving right there.
Preventing wasted development effort.
Exactly. Plus, even when training is needed, you spend far less time developing vast amounts of information presentations and tedious content dumps. You focus your development effort much more efficiently on designing those effective, targeted practice activities. And because those activities are generally more engaging, more relevant, and laser-focused on application, learners often learn more efficiently and retain the skills better, which can reduce the need for costly follow-up training or remediation down the line.
So the total time and money spent on actually solving the business problem, including the focused solution development and implementation, is often less, even if that initial analysis phase feels like a greater upfront investment compared to just blindly accepting the content and starting to build.
Exactly. You're not wasting precious resources building the wrong thing and inevitably getting no meaningful results. And the source emphasizes that getting buy-in from clients and SMEs early By involving them deeply in the analysis and showing them concrete examples, even rough prototypes of what the activities will look and feel like, is absolutely key to navigating this process smoothly and building enthusiasm and cooperation from the start.
And for the designer personally, this approach seems like a much more fulfilling and respected way to work compared to just being seen as a glorified slide decorator.
Oh, absolutely. The source lists significant benefits for you, the designer. You're seen as a respected problem solver and a strategic partner, not just a technician who churns out courses on demand. You gain invaluable insight into how the organization actually works
Yeah.
and the real challenges people face on the ground. You get to enjoy the creative challenge of designing, engaging, realistic activities, which is often much more stimulating than just organizing information. You become proactive, spotting potential performance issues and proposing solutions rather than just passively waiting for training requests to land in your inbox. You find more meaning and purpose in your work because you're making a tangible, measurable difference to the business and to the people actually doing the job. And ultimately, this approach can genuinely help advance your career because you're demonstrating clear business impact, which is what leadership values.
That shift from order taker to performance consultant, focused squarely on outcomes, seems central to both the organization's success and the designer's own job satisfaction and career growth.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And the source concludes with a really strong, perhaps even provocative statement on this. It argues that it's actually bordering on unethical to simply accept a request and create training on demand when your professional analysis suggests it won't actually solve the real performance problem.
Unethical? That's strong.
It is strong. But the reasoning is that ultimately your role is to help the organization succeed. And that means genuinely solving the problem that inspired the training request in the first place, even if the best solution doesn't look like the training they initially asked for. That's what truly benefits the organization and ultimately justifies your position and your pay. Focusing on solving the problem, not just delivering a product.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener, as you think about your own work in learning, training, or performance improvement? We've taken a really deep dive into a powerful alternative to the traditional school model of training design. It's about fundamentally shifting our focus.
A real paradigm shift.
Moving away from simply transferring knowledge to strategically identifying and solving real business performance problems.
It means deliberately stepping out of that comfortable cloud of knowledge, that default mode of thinking about content first, and taking a hard, honest look at the practical rocks people are actually trying to navigate in their daily jobs.
It means asking, why aren't they doing it? Digging into those root causes before you ever assume training is the answer.
Absolutely. And then when training is determined to be part of the solution, it means designing realistic experiences where people actively practice doing the job, learning from the realistic consequences of their actions in a safe space rather than just passively memorizing facts or procedures.
The source material, particularly Kathy Moore's Map It, makes a really compelling case that this action mapping approach, while it definitely requires a change in mindset and maybe some challenging upfront conversations,
It's not always easy at first.
it ultimately saves time and money, creates vastly more effective and appreciated solutions, and significantly elevates the role and impact of the designer or learning professional. It challenges all of us to focus relentlessly on measurable business impact and to think of ourselves as performance consultants first and designers or trainers second.
It's a different way of thinking, for sure, and it requires you to become really adept at helping your stakeholders, your clients, your SMEs think differently about the problem and the potential solutions as well. You're guiding them through this process too.
And here's where it gets really interesting and maybe something for you to think about long after this deep dive is over, building on the source's concluding thoughts.
Yeah.
The source asks, essentially, what are the rewards for that belief? The belief that our clients actually care, or maybe can be persuaded to care, about the measurable business impact of our work, not just the delivery of training courses or the checking of boxes.
It's a belief that definitely requires some courage, right? And a willingness to challenge assumptions, both our own and others. But what happens when you actually take that leap? When you operate from that belief?
What do you think those rewards are when you commit to that belief and truly focus on solving the real performance problem? What are the benefits for you personally and professionally as you shift your approach? And what are the rewards for the people you're trying to help on the job and for the organization as a whole? How does focusing on real-world action and measurable business outcomes fundamentally change the game for everyone involved?
It's a really powerful question. It goes way beyond just the mechanics of design tools and project workflows and probes the very purpose and ultimate value of the work we do in this field.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. We hope it gives you some powerful ideas to mull over, maybe some courage to challenge the conventional, and perhaps some practical steps you can apply to your own work to find more impactful ways to truly help people succeed on the job.